When we are emotionally regulated, it means that we are able to acknowledge our emotions as they arise. We're able to respond to those with a calm, considered manner rather than reacting, and also acknowledging I'm a neurodivergent individual and can be very impulsive sometimes in my reactions and responses.
I could list so many times in my schooling where a teacher has been dysregulated and blamed it back on the students. It's like, someone's thrown a ruler before. They've banged a desk. Teacher cries. We don't feel guilty. We feel bad for them.
When we are activated, what's happening in our body is we're in fight or flight or fawn state in a sense. Our nervous system is elevated. And so we actually physically have more blood in our limbs and less blood in our core organs, which means our physiological state is impacted.
Yeah.
Our psychological state is impacted. And that, just being in that impacted state, impacts the state of our entire room and space. Podclass acknowledges the traditional and true custodians of the land we meet on here today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We're grateful to be here.
So no one told you teaching was gonna be this way. Your lesson plans are jokes, your patience broke, you're feeling in disarray. It's like you're always stuck in report writing, when it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, or even your school year. But I'll be here for you.
When the students start to riot,
I'll be here for you.
even if your coffee's gone cold,
I'll be here for you. 'Cause you're there for them too.
Hello and welcome back to Podclass. You're joined, as always, by these friendly faces, Will Massara, Amanda Marshall, and myself, Skye Hughes.
Hello.
Diaz.
Hello. We are
Another
Good morning in
language.
Spanish.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So our audience is used to this by now.
Yes.
We are here today, and this is the one about emotional regulation. And we think that this is just a really important topic because we know that we can't expect to hold space for young people that are in our care if we are not emotionally regulated ourselves. And we just can't do that. So we are activated, and you'll notice us use the word activated throughout this podcast. So when we talk about activated rather than triggered, when we talk about triggered, it's usually because there's an association with our current experience with something that's happened in the past. But when we talk about being activated, it's usually just in response to the current moment that we're in, the experience that we're in. So activated and triggered just have slightly different meanings when we talk about kind of trauma-informed practice and learning.
And I think we'll also be referencing phrases, this is the one about emotional regulation. So we'll be referencing being activated. We'll also reference regulation and dysregulation. And probably when we think about those phrases, all of us would be quite familiar with the term dysregulated. We know what it's like to feel dysregulated. We know what it's like to feel overwhelmed. And we also know what it's like when we have a classroom where the, lion's share of young people in the space or in the workshop are dysregulated. And we know what happens there. So what we'll be doing throughout this episode is we'll be looking at what is being regulated and dysregulated, and how can we support young people in those states, and how can we support ourselves? Because this, it could be considered a bit heavy, but we firmly believe that if we are going to guide and lead young people in learning and exploration, we have a responsibility to manage our state. And our state plays a role in the space, and it plays a larger role than we possibly ever expected.
Yes. Could not agree more. Yeah, it's so important. And we often forget this as adults. And I think as well, like you were just saying, there's assumed knowledge about what it actually means to be in a regulated state or to be dysregulated. So I guess probably a good place to start is to talk about what does it actually mean to be emotionally regulated? Because we can become dysregulated in a moment, but in our lives, as we just move through our day-to-day, we can try and maintain and be in a regulated state. And what does it actually mean? So it means when we are emotionally regulated, it means that we are able to kind of acknowledge our emotions as they arise. We're able to respond to those with a calm, kind of considered manner rather than becoming, reacting really like impulsively or in the moment, and also acknowledging I'm a neurodivergent individual and can be very impulsive sometimes in my reactions and responses. So not in any way to minimize or make wrong people who experience that, but really just to be more conscious and aware of our state of being, knowing that we have tools and techniques that we can rely on when we feel things come up that might activate our systems, that fight or flight response kind of kicks in, but knowing that I'm going to acknowledge what I'm feeling right now. I'm going to maybe use a breathing technique or move my body or do whatever it is I need to do to find that state of being regulated.
And just because you or I can't control our impulse all the time, that does not always mean that we're dysregulated either, does it?
No, totally. And it's like we just said, it's just being aware. It's that awareness of the emotion. It's being able to have like what we would call like cognitive reappraisal, where we can look kind of objectively at a scenario or step out of something and really look at it in like, you know, how can we frame this so that it makes sense to us rather than kind of judging it? It's coming from a place of curiosity. It's being interested in the experience that we're having in that moment.
And if we look at the flip side of like, what is dysregulation, it's so much more common for us to know when a child or a toddler is dysregulated because they're screaming or yelling, or when a dog is dysregulated because they're going ruff, ruff, ruff. But then if we look at like, what does it look when we're dysregulated as an adult? It's like their mood swings or them unable to control that impulse or that inappropriate and like, but then emotional balance that we can't control. And I know for me, I could list so many times in my schooling where a teacher has been dysregulated and blamed it back on the students. It's like, someone's thrown a ruler before, they've banged a desk, they've stormed out. When the teacher cries, it's like, but then we don't feel guilty, we feel bad for them. It's like,
and it is never, ever, 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 ever a student's responsibility to regulate or make an adult feel good.
Like
that is not the child's job.
Ruler, walk out, and we're like, well, whoops.
I remember in primary school, and when we were chatting about this episode off air, and I was having these flashbacks. I think it might have been grade 4 possibly. And what I remember just having a really scary teacher. Like that's my memory of it. And when I reflect back, what I had was a highly dysregulated teacher, a teacher that became activated very, very easily.
Which as an adult, you can reflect on that and understand that. But when you are a young person, you don't yet have the emotional cognitive capacity to have that assessment and that appraisal of what's going on. But young people are so intuitive. So they're feeling all of that, even though they might not have the language or the words to be able to label it and understand it.
It is curious, because I also had a teacher who was like, they've been dysregulated. I don't know, can you have long-term dysregulation? Because
definitely.
I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and like my cousins went through school like 15 years before me, and it was the same teacher, and they obviously were dysregulated with them, and then I was labelled like in that family.
Yeah, that is a long period of dysregulation. 15 years.
they didn't like me because they didn't like my cousins 15 years early. I'm like,
that's when we would be saying therapy is really helpful and useful. Yeah.
And I think if we're going to picture like a visual for regulation and dysregulation, I almost picture like water boiling. And it's like regulation is like, the water's like hot, but it's stable and it's like, not bubbling over. And then if we're in a dysregulated state, if we think about emotions, it's, if we've ever had a pot on the stove, and it's bubbling and it's overflowing. And the thing is that we can be right on, when we're dysregulated, we're right on that cusp, and it can take the tiniest little thing in our space and suddenly we're boiling over. And
it feels like someone's
between 2 degrees, right?
Yeah. And it feels like someone continuing, because it can, when we are in a dysregulated state, we become hyper aware of those things that are happening around us and we can become more activated about what's happening. Yeah. And it's like someone consistently pressing the boil button. Is what it feels like. So we've had no space to be able to regulate, to cool down, to have time for ourselves.
Yeah. And so I think it's the right time to mention that this episode is not about invalidating teachers' emotions. And it is not about saying you can't have your own challenges. What we are saying is this: if you are not managing your own state, or not across your own state, or not connected to your own state, what's happening is your students have the capacity to hit that boil button. And the second we are boiling and there's overflow, that overflow is us projecting onto the people around us. Yeah. And projecting onto our students is never it's just not something we should be doing.
And I know the difference between when I walk into a classroom and I've had time for myself, at the end of a morning tea or a lunch break or whatever, and I've taken a few breaths and I've walked in and I've got a smile on my face, and the energy that I'm putting out is like, I'm so excited to teach today. I'm really excited to see my students, as opposed to like, I haven't had time to go to the bathroom. I'm really rushed. I'm like racing through the school. I've forgotten which classroom I'm in. I finally get there. I dump all the resources and I'm like, all right, everyone, why haven't we got our books out yet? The students are like, like they feel that so much. And it's the difference between us just taking 10 seconds, 15 seconds for ourselves to move ourselves into that regulated state, so that then we can have that flow and effect go into our classrooms.
And because we're dysregulated, we completely are blind to the fact that they can see it too.
Totally.
Well, yeah, that our self-awareness and our capacity to read and respond is just null and void. And interestingly, when we are activated, what's happening in our body is we're in kind of like that fight or flight or fawn state in a sense. You know, our nervous system is elevated. And so we actually physically have more blood in our limbs and less blood in our core organs, which means our physiological state is impacted.
Yeah.
Our psychological state is impacted. And that just being in that impacted state impacts the state of our entire room and space.
And I mean, we've been talking about it, but what we've kind of just been discussing is why it is so important for us to be regulated in our classrooms.
So how do we do it? That's the next question.
So how do we do it? And particularly, how do we do it when we maybe have young people who have particular behaviours that show up in our classrooms that can feel as though that it also may activate us or it has a flow-on effect to other students that are in our care. So how do we do that? And I would say that the very first thing is to remember that it is never, ever personal. You know, I've said it before, I'll say it again. A student doesn't wake up, come to school with the intention of, I'm going to piss off my teacher today. Like, that is not why they're showing up or how they're showing up. And often behaviors that we're seeing are really just an external reflection of something that's going on internally. And so if we can just remember in the moment that it is not personal, that is really going to help us to stay regulated and calm.
And I think like any part of self-awareness is how are we feeling right now? And
Yeah.
I think this has been probably the biggest journey of self-awareness that I've been on, is like actually checking in with ourselves. I use this app now. I'm pretty sure it's called How Are You Feeling? And it's like you literally select your feeling based on all of these different emotions. And then you check in twice or 3 times a day and it reminds you. And you can actually track. And then at the end of the week, it's like, how was my week? How did I feel? Because if you don't know where you are right now, I say it quite regularly, you can't change it, right?
Yeah. You have to understand how you're feeling, your emotional current state, in order to move into your preferred state.
And also teaching our young people and modeling that for our young people is so, so powerful, right?
And I'd like to acknowledge the courage and vulnerability that takes. It does take courage and vulnerability to acknowledge where we're at, because it's not always easy and it's not always rainbows and sunshine, and that's okay. And if we hold ourselves to a standard where we think it's meant to always be rainbows and sunshine, that's just making ourselves wrong, and that leads to dysregulation.
Yes.
So another strategy is something called co-regulation. And, you know, co-regulation is actually occurring as the leader of our space. Co-regulation is occurring all of the time. We don't flick a switch when we're feeling terrific and regulated and suddenly co-regulation occurs. Like, if we are activated and in a dysregulated state, co-regulation is still occurring. It still has an impact. So knowing that it's occurring all of the time and taking responsibility for where we're at through our own practice. For me personally, yes, it's about what we can do in the moment, but it's also about how do we set ourselves up for success before we even get to school or before our students walk into the classroom. What do we need? And I think, you know, like, there are always outliers. There are always unexpected deadlines and meetings and stresses and, you know, phone calls and whatever it is. But what is our absolute boundary? Like, is it just simply 5 minutes where you sit quietly, you breathe, you play some music or a meditation, or you stand outside and breathe some fresh air or whatever it is, and you just get in your body?
Yeah.
Like, it can be as simple as that.
And it's also okay though, if you have, say, a young person who's maybe in a state of dysregulation in your classroom and you've knelt down to their desk to do a check-in, it might be just saying and acknowledging, if you're also then feeling activated as a response to that, being like, oh, I'm feeling like it's a little bit overwhelming in here right now. What I'm going to do right now is just take a few breaths to kind of help to calm down my system. If that feels good for you, maybe you'd like to do that with me.
Yeah.
And that's also a form of being able to model and acknowledging and validating those feelings. Like, it's normal to feel this way. It's okay to have responses to things. What we don't want to do is have a generation of young people that squash down all of those feelings that they have because it's not okay to express them.
Yeah.
Instead, we're teaching them the tools so they can express that in a really healthy and safe way, in ways that feel good for them and feel good for their body. And we can teach that by modeling that for ourselves.
And if a student does act out or like does become dysregulated, just remember and also have compassion for them that their boiling point has been reached.
Yeah.
What can I do to turn off that boiling point and bring it down, rather than trying to like almost aggravate it more?
Yeah. What can I support them to do for themselves?
And often, like we've spoken about before, they know. It's providing them some space, giving them the autonomy to do what they need to do in that moment to come back into that learning state.
And we all know how it can be following a recess or a lunchtime where things have gone down.
Yeah.
And, you know, how young people can walk into our spaces. And sometimes it's so tempting. We have deadlines, we have outcomes, we have things to do. It's so tempting to push through that state and focus on the outcomes versus spending 5 minutes to do some breathing or have a conversation or pull out some connection cards or whatever it might be. It's tempting to, because we don't have the time. But the thing is if we invest that time, it's just that, it's time invested, that we will reap the outcomes for the rest of the lesson. And we're probably going to have less challenging behaviors occurring as well, that they tend to come from more of a dysregulated, disengaged space.
I think that's a really nice point to kind of end on and wrap up this conversation too, is also just for teachers listening, for parents, for whoever, finding out what works for you. What does work for you? What is that thing that helps you get back in balance? How can we become more aware of our emotions as we're moving through our day-to-day lives? And how do we model that with our young people?
Yeah, and I think as well, so often there's so much information. It's really easy to get overwhelmed with big terms and complicated actions. And, I think we've said it before on a previous podcast, but if we're not sure where to start, let's come back to the basics and let's do that with ourselves first. Let's look at our sleep, our water, our food, our sunshine, our fresh air, our movement. Like literally just those things.
Just the vitamins.
Where are they at, And then let's go from there. Then let's start learning and growing on top of that. But that alone is life-changing.
And you've heard it here first from Will. Take your vitamins. Thank you so much for joining us.
Imagine you are a sim on the Sims game. How are the bars? Are they green or are they red?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great
Where's our
visual.
battery?
Let's have a look at it.
We are Podclass. This has been on.
I think that's
on team.
The one about emotional regulation.
Emotional regulation.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
I'll be here for you, 'cause you're there for them too.
Thanks so much for tuning into Podclass. If you've enjoyed this episode, we would adore it if you could go on to Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. 5 stars would be lovely. We would love to get this podcast into as many ears as possible so we can help and support as many people as possible who help young people. And if you're not already doing so, please go along to Instagram and follow us at podclass.aus.